Hi team, in this video we're going to look at aggregate supply, and so similar to aggregate demand you need to understand what aggregate supply is and then all the factors that go into shifting the curve, so either left or right, and then all the impacts that is going to have on our economy. So there's your definition for aggregate supply, basically all the stuff that producers can produce at a given point in time, and then we're dealing with our regular ASAD diagram. It's important to note the aggregate supply curve is physically curved, so when you draw it, make sure it's got that bend in it. And the reason being is that at one point or another, if we continue to increase our output, we're going to get to a point where we reach our productive capacity and we physically cannot increase our output from that point. And so if you look at the way the curve moves, as you go across it, you'll see that along your x-axis, there's going to be an increase in output. And it continues to increase and increase and increase until we get to this bit where it's pretty much becoming a straight line. That suggests we are at capacity. We cannot produce any more goods and services. And so the line needs to become vertical to represent that. Good to know, not a need to know, but make sure when you draw it, it's got that bend in it. Okay, so our job today is to come in and analyze all the factors that cause basically this scenario to happen. Likewise, we want to understand the factors that cause the aggregate supply curve to shift to the left. And so you'll note that when you are able to increase aggregate supply from AS1 to AS2, the economy enjoys a whole bunch of different benefits. Number one, inflation goes down. And we'll talk about why in future slides, but effectively what's happening there is that if you're able to basically increase the amount of stuff that you can produce at a given point in time, it means that there's a whole host of factors that have gone into potentially reducing your cost of production, and you pass that on to consumers in the form of lower prices. So we don't need to unpack that in too much detail right now. What I do want you to focus on, however, is the x-axis, and you'll notice that there's an increase in real GDP from Y1 to Y2. So more goods and services are being produced, which means there's going to be an increase in the demand for labour resources, and so we also see a decrease in unemployment. Now, there's 9 factors that you need to know. They are relatively straightforward, but you do need to know them explicitly. In most cases, they basically funnel back to this one, cost of production, which is its own standalone factor, but we'll be talking about cost of production in essence for all of these as we go through it. So, nice and simple to start off with. If you've got more factors of production, the quantity increases. It means you've got more land, labour, capital and enterprise as an economy to produce goods and services. So if you've got more of that, obviously your output is able to increase. All right, the next one is the quality of the factors of production. Now let's get this really clear. This is not quantity. Quantity and quality are 2 separate arguments. This one deals with the fact that of the land, labour, capital and enterprise that you already have, we're now just using it better. Okay, so we're using it more productively to achieve greater output. So the better quality the land, labour, capital or enterprise of an economy, the more output it can achieve. Think about you guys studying at school or uni or whoever, whatever. You're studying, you're getting an education to ultimately become, I suppose, more intelligent so that you're able to make a greater contribution to whatever level of employment you find yourself in a couple of years. So by doing that, your quality, the quality of the labour you are able to provide is likely to be higher, such that you are now going to be more productive. And so although you might only represent one piece of labour or one unit of labour, the quality with which you can contribute to the production process is increasing. So you become more productive. I've said here, note that this does not refer to more factors of production, but just using our existing factors of production in a more productive way to achieve greater output. This tells a sad story in that case. So I'm going to look at labour productivity for a moment. So let's just look at the black line. You can see that labour productivity over time has declined. So basically this means that the level of output per unit of labour input, I'll say that one more time, the level of output that is achieved per unit of labour input has been declining. So we are becoming less productive. And so basically, guys, what that means for producers is they aren't able to produce as many goods and services as they once were, and their cost of production is going to go up. This is a sad story for aggregate supply. It ultimately shifts it to the left, okay? The next one is cost of production. This one's nice and simple. So basically, if the cost of production for a producer goes up, it becomes more expensive for them to produce a good or service on average. And so that means that their capacity to produce goes down. That shifts my aggregate supply to the left, which ultimately leads to a decrease in output. This is, obviously what the graph would look like. This is a past exam question. Which one of the following is likely to cause the shift in the aggregate supply? So we're looking for the outcome that decreases AS because the curve in the diagram is shifting to the left. So a decrease in interest rates. Well, we know that interest rates are an AD factor, so let's just get rid of that one. There's an increase in production costs. Now, that to me sounds like an increase in the cost of production. So I'm going to lock in B, but I'm just going to check C and D as well. An increase in government spending. Again, government spending is an AD factor, so I don't see it impacting, obviously, AS in any kind of way at the moment. And there's an increase in the profitability of businesses. Well, if you've got more profits, then you can increase your investment spending, which could be an aggregate demand side factor. The other part is if you've got more profits and you're spending it to improve your productive capacity, aggregate supply should be increasing. So the only logical answer here, team, is B. All right, the next factor is technological change. Come at this one with a little bit of common sense. If technology is improving, then obviously that's going to support improvements in output, either because we are able to use our resources more productively. It could be the case we come up with new production processes that are simply faster and more efficient. If you think about the way AI is beginning to change the workforce and replacing humans, basically we are seeing situations where producers have access to technologies that are allowing their production processes to move at a greater pace. So this should feed into that decrease of the cost of production that we spoke about before and shift aggregate supply to the right, which indicates an increase in output. Productivity growth. Now, this one will muck you around quite significantly if you don't get the definition down pat early. Okay, so productivity growth refers to the increase in output per unit of input over time. Okay, let me say that again. Increase in output relative to input, not unlike looking at the quality of the factors of production factor a few slides ago. So it's where an increase in productivity growth leads to an increase in efficiency. Let's be really specific. We're talking about productive efficiency, how well we use our resources, hence an increase in output. So if we see improvements in productivity in our labour, in our land, in our capital, it means that we're able to reduce the cost of production per unit, okay? The average cost of each unit produced goes down. We're able to increase our output. We're shifting our aggregate supply curve to the right, okay? Explain the relationship between an efficient allocation of resources and aggregate supply. There's a few ways you can answer this one, but I've put it here because it wouldn't be a bad idea to speak to this factor, productivity growth, through the idea of productive efficiency. So ultimately, if you're seeing an improvement in productive efficiency, we've got greater output per unit of input. That's going to reduce my average cost of each unit produced. My cost of production goes down. That shifts my aggregate supply to the right. So there's a lot there. Don't need you to be an expert in this one right now, but just think about the connections between this particular factor and everything we've said so far about aggregate supply. Exchange rates will get you. If you're still confused about exchange rates in terms of aggregate demand, go back to those slides and watch it again before you tackle this one. This one's saying that if you're a producer in Australia and you rely on imports in your production process, which so many of our producers do, the change in exchange rates is going to impact your cost of production. So let's assume there's an appreciation of the Aussie dollar. You're an Australian producer and you need to buy something from China to go into your production process. Because the Aussie dollar has appreciated, your purchasing power increases, which means now the cost of you buying that thing from China is relatively cheaper. And so if it's cheaper, that represents a decrease in the cost of production. And as we know, that leads to an increase in aggregate supply and leads to an increase in output, okay? The flip side is true. So if there's a depreciation of the Aussie dollar, now my purchasing power as an Australian producer has gone down. When I buy that thing from China, it's going to cost me more. Now my cost of production goes up, and that's going to decrease aggregate supply and decrease output. So you've got to be ready to handle both arguments, an increase or a decrease, or I should say an appreciation or a depreciation of the exchange rate. Remember, bring it back to purchasing power. Just like we did in aggregate demand, how is the purchasing power changing? How is that going to change, obviously, my capacity to muck around with, in this case, imports, but with aggregate demand, imports and exports. This is not an export argument. This is an import argument for those producers that rely on imports in the production process. Not going to speak to this one right now. Climatic conditions. So this one's really nice and simple. Basically, if you've got favourable climatic conditions, you should be able to see a decrease in the average cost of production, which will increase output, which ultimately, as signalled by an increase in aggregate supply. So negative climatic conditions such as drought or bushfires, which are obviously really pertinent to Australia, it's going to be more difficult to produce given the challenges faced in accessing inputs such as land, labour, capital and enterprise, particularly land. Land is quite vulnerable to this one, just given the nature of working in the agricultural sector. So if you have good rainfall and ideal growing conditions, that's fabulous. That's going to hopefully support an increase in your yields of your crops. But if it goes the other way, you're going to wear it in the form of an increase in the cost of production. Hopefully that one's making sense. I won't go through this, but we have had our wettest El Nino summer on record, and that's wreaked havoc for farmers in, depending on where they are, positive and negative ways. All right, we're getting there. So government regulations. So the two main ones that we're going to talk about are indirect taxes and subsidies. Cast your mind back to Unit 3.1. We talked about these in relation to government intervention in response to market failure. So indirect taxation is levied on the production of a product. Let's say you're in Australia and you produce cigarettes and the government decides to put indirect tax up again. Well, you're going to wear that in the form of an increase in the cost of production, which shifts that aggregate supply to the left, and then it decreases output. And then the opposite argument is that if you receive a subsidy, so financial support paid by the government to a producer, it should lead to a decrease in the cost of production, which will ultimately increase your output. So when you see the word government regulation, just be ready with indirect tax or subsidies, depending on the argument. Disruptions in overseas supply chains. So disruptions to overseas supply chains leave the Australian economy vulnerable to supply side shocks. So if we're at the mercy of imports or supply chains overseas and something happens to those supply chains, we're going to feel it, as in producers are going to feel it in the sense they're not going to be positioned to continue producing at their current levels. I've got an example here. So in 2021, the Suez Canal blockage meant that ships couldn't pass through this integral trade route. There was literally a boat that got wedged between sort of the two heads. And this held up cargo and delayed the delivering of imports to all over the world, and obviously we felt it here in Australia. Hence, many producers did not receive these inputs in a timely manner, such that their production processes were negatively impacted. So again, that shift to the left of aggregate supply for that moment in time, and that decreased output. Guys, just a couple of practice exam questions. Explain how one AD and one AS factor have caused changes in the business cycle. You're now positioned to answer this because you've got your AD and your AS factors together. This is not a 4-mark question. It is a 2x2 mark question, okay? The business cycle in Australia, you would need to know what phase we were in and then pick a supply side factor that is then going to speak to that. I'll leave it there. Hopefully that makes sense. Thank you.